And welcome back to the Friday lunchtime seminar series after a wee break. Housekeeping for people that aren't knowledgeable about this building. Earthquakes, drop cover hole. And leave it. Yep, brilliant. Okay, and any emergencies, exit here, out of the doors on the left, and then I'm afraid you'll have to stand in the rain by the steps near the ambulance depot, so hopefully nothing will happen. And today we have Seth Campbell, who's going to talk about the Moab, I may have said that wrong, 320 kilometer ultramarathon and why suffering is good for you. And that's a discussion of the impact of running 320 kilometers on the human body, brain, and lessons one runner has derived from these types of runs and how it can apply to daily challenges. Following a stint in the US Army, Special Operations, Seth arrived in New Zealand in 2001 with a Kiwi wife to complete an MBIE at Victoria. New Zealand is now home, and Seth has moved from a failed agri-tech startup to roles in tertiary and science funding systems, and most recently to building regulatory systems for MB. So 2 boys, ultramarathon running, and triathlons, keep him well-rounded. So thanks very much.
Super. Thanks, Caroline, for having me, and thanks, Sophie, for doing some of the logistics around getting me here today. So most appreciated. Great to be in front of you folks, and shout out to everybody who's doing it virtually. I know it's always kind of challenging when we're catering to the real audience, but try to do my best to keep you moderately engaged with looking at you occasionally if I can. The way I'm going to run this, guys, is take about 20-25 minutes for my presentation. Then we'll get into hopefully 15-20 minutes of discussion or questions or anything you want to throw at me, or just a general free-for-all and anything that's kind of moderately interesting, either about running or these types of events you might have. So I'll try to not do it too quickly, but enough so that we can have a bit of discussion at the end. So breakdown for the talk. I don't have to actually look at it that way. I can see it here. So a bit of a thumbnail sketch of me, just to try and give you a bit of context on how I got to do this event, sort of why I do it. I think people always ask, like, what are you doing with this thing, Seth? Then I'll just go through the race itself, and then I'll jump into a bit of the details around that, but try and then conclude with a bit of what I call the distillation, some of the things that have resonated with me from doing these types of events, and that hopefully you can sort of will at least be interesting, and ideally you can take away and say, hey, that's an interesting angle. I'd like to think about that some more, or maybe I'll find a way to inject some of these lessons, sounds a bit strong, but some of these things into my own life. So that's the general run, and then the Q&A. So jumping into the sort of how did I get here, key part of this is I don't want this to sound like a race rundown, similar to what you get at work when the guy comes off a round of golf on the weekend and starts to tell you about the whole thing. Nothing more boring, right? So I will avoid going into the nitty-gritty granular, but just try and give you enough of a flavor of the race itself and how I ended up doing it. So I grew up in a place called Martha's Vineyard in the United States. It's off the coast of Massachusetts. Probably most famous for the Kennedy family, and they've had a bunch of misfortunate sort of experiences in that area, from Teddy Kennedy killing a girl when he was driving drunk, went off a bridge, and more recently John Kennedy Jr. burned his plane in. Both himself, his sister-in-law, and his sister were killed, unfortunately. So not a great place for the Kennedys, but a great place if you ever want to go for a nice summer holiday, maybe after COVID's over, but certainly a nice place to grow up. So grew up there, and wasn't doing that great in academics. So my parents said, time for you to go to boarding school, a little more discipline, a little more structure. So off I went to do that. And that was where I first joined my first cross-country team. And that was all driven around 5-kilometer races. Felt significant at the time, but so sort of started to get my running chops and feeling what this whole thing about running is all about, really. From there, I went and did a stint at university where I joined the cross-country team there as well. Started to doing 10K runs, big, massive, brutal distance I thought at the time. Really, really long and painful, but you know, sort of started to come to grips with that and migrate into sort of half marathons and marathons a little bit. But the big part of it in my next phase of my life was some time in the Army. They paid my way to university, so I ultimately owed them some time. So I went into a unit called the 75th Ranger Regiment, which was a lot of fun, difficult, torturous, etc. While I was in that, I got a lot of experience with running with heavy stuff on my back, carrying it for long distances, and got to do some really cool training, Ranger School, where you effectively learn how to be sleep deprived, calorie deprived, and generally suffer, as well as some training in something called SEER School, where you get the unique opportunity to be a POW. So we're experiencing sort of forms of light interrogation, including being naked while getting interrogated. So the Army gives you all kinds of great opportunities that were certainly left a mark in a good way. But yeah, it was a interesting training environment. I think probably is where I really got into this whole notion of where do you find these activities that can really test you and that are interesting sort of ways to experience, I'll call it pain. I don't want to call it masochism, but it's just, you know, how do you test yourself and find out if you can get over the line of what everybody's telling you can't do. So that's kind of the headspace, I think. Next slide. So where am I now? After meeting my wife in the States, we got married over there, came over here, and ended up doing a MBIE at Vic, as Caroline said, and now have, I think, what George Carlin called a place for my stuff, a house with all the other stuff, 2 kids, a dog, and all the other accoutrements of, I guess, a pretty nice life in Croydon, the city in the sky, which is a lot of fun. And boys keep me active, trying to get them into some running, which is always a bit of a trial and tribulation, but they're starting to find their way. So I think really probably the key thing looking back at it from where I sit today is that sense of how do you find these events that give you that test. And I sort of got into Ironman triathlons when I was in New Zealand, started to get into ultra running, which is defined as anything more than 50 kilometers. And is just these types of events I slowly started getting into and feeling my way through up to sort of 100 miles. And it was at that point where I was listening to a podcast and heard about this race called Moab, this 240-mile, 386-kilometer race. I was like, that's ridiculous. You know, nobody's running that. I'd done 100-mile races before. I was like, no way, double that plus some? Insane. And it was kind of that weird thing just kind of playing in my ear. I was like, well, let's see if I can get into it. So I entered it, got into it. And I was like, all right, I got to find some buddies who are going to go over with me. So really key part of this is your support crew. Paul Hewitson, who's actually here today up in the top right, and another guy, Paul Thompson, agreed to do this with me. So we went over in 2018 to Utah, which is where the race is held, and ultimately did the race. So it was one of those weird things that just kind of emerged, and it was very much going into it of like, I have no idea if I can finish this thing or do it. So kind of got into it in a big way. I want to give you a bit of a flavor. I like this picture just because it gives you a sense of what you're doing in terms of the elevation and the up and down, about 9,000 up, 9,000 down. So the elevation is, you know, painful, but it also is a good thing because you're getting a lot of variety terrain-wise, and I'll show you some pictures of that. But it's, I think, indicative of why this race is challenging because you're going through so many different terrain types, everything from, you know, your sort of flat desert-like with mesas all the way up to mountains and snow. So it's, you get sort of every type of terrain thrown at you along with the conditions that come with that terrain. So a really interesting challenge in that sense of what these things can throw at you. In terms of the race itself, just some of the key points. It's, as I said, 386 kilometers. The way to think about it, which I try to avoid in the race, is 9 marathons. So you're stacking up a ridiculous amount of distance. It's got a 112-hour cutoff, so that means you've got to finish the thing before 112 hours, or you get the dreaded DNF, the acronym that every runner athlete really hates, which is did not finish. You don't want that thing next to your name as kind of the tag of shame. So if you don't finish in time, that's what you get. And that was always kind of it's a good motivator when you're in these types of events to try and avoid that. Other than that, I'll give you the first. This was the start. I'm in the bottom right there looking kind of weird, but it's a really, it's about 150 racers who start this thing. I call them freaks and geeks affectionately just because it's a weird bunch. It's a really great cross-section of society, international runners, Americans. Really good vibe in these types of events because you're really competing against both yourself and the terrain, not each other. So it's very much a lot of camaraderie. It's three-day core. Everybody's trying to help each other out in the course, and just a lot of fun, really interesting stories that you sort of get into with these guys. And you go pretty deep during these types of events, getting to know somebody, you know, better than you would probably some of your work colleagues, just because you really are at your worst moments having your conversations with these guys. So kind of fun in that sense. So we kick off, and this starts out very slowly. It's not like a 5K or 10K race where people are burning through red zone, you know, 3-minute Ks type stuff. It's pretty slow, just because you know you've got about 3 to 4 days of racing in front of you. So it kicks off slow and steady, I think. Give you a flavor on sleep. I did about 6 hours of sleep, all up, about 12 hours of what we call sort of downtime. I think my support guys were constantly trying to get me up off my butt. They'd wake me up, slap my feet. Let's go, Campbell, you gotta go. And it's just, you're trying to find this sort of key balance between too much sleep where you start to lose time and too little where you turn into the true, what we call the drone monkey. And it's just, you know, you see racers who try to push it too far. They start hallucinating, they go off course, they start, you know, babbling away. You just lose your ability to be a focused human being. And so if you get to that point, you're going to have to sleep for probably a lot longer than you would if you try and get that nice incremental, you know, a little bit of sleep here, a little bit of sleep there. So it's a real sort of balancing act in that sense. Temperature-wise, 25, I think, was the high, and 0 in some places when we got into the some of the elevation. So really brutal bunch of temps. And you know, you're kind of just trying to accommodate the fact you're sweating some hours, and then you're getting into that real sort of, you know, literally my water bottles and my running vest were freezing. I mean, that kind of cold. So it was difficult sort of advanced problem solving to try and deal with some of those temperatures as you're going through this thing. I finished in about 84 hours and 22 minutes. Just to give you a flavor of where that puts me, the pros who are winning this thing are doing it in about 60 hours. And amazing female runner, won it 2 years ago, just crushed it. And I mean, it's really kind of interesting in the ultra space to see the equalness between female and male runners, and in many cases, the females just crushing the male pack. So it's kind of an intriguing element of the sports science and how females are potentially better at some aspects of ultra running. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch over the next couple of years as you see more and more females just crushing some of these events with whether it's endurance, pain ability, sleep, who knows, but it's just, yeah, it's kind of cool to see the real challenge that female competitors are putting in this space. Give you a sense of the vistas. So that's just one, I think that was when I was still feeling pretty good on the first day. I was like, oh, I gotta take a picture. That sort of slipped as I went through, and you just kind of start to note the terrain quite a bit, but it doesn't quite resonate as strongly as the first couple of days. But amazing scenery. If you ever get to go to Moab, strongly recommended. Arches National Park, just fantastic. It's got the kind of place where you go after seeing the pictures, you're still, it will blow your mind. You're like, wow. One of the challenges, yeah, as I said, you're going through that kind of pain and fog of fatigue, but even then you'd still get moments where I was like, wow, this is just spectacular, you know, and really special part of the world / the US. And it's just, it really resonates that you're going through this in varying degrees of pain and discomfort. Move on to some of this, the first night. One of the aspects of this that I talked about is the comradeship. So you're moving, it's kind of like an accordion in these races. You know, people really stretch out. So you'll have times when you're with people and other times you're totally alone. And you know, for instance, I think the first 30 miles of the race, I passed this guy who was urinating blood, was throwing up. And I was like, dude, how you doing? Obviously not bad, obviously not well. And he's like, well, I gotta get, you know, I've got 15K at the next aid station. I think I can make that one. You're kind of like, dude, let's not have your kidneys shut down on you. So you find these just ridiculous sort of moments, vignettes of people who are just experiencing extreme suffering and still, you know, driving on. And it's just kind of like those little microcosms you see throughout these races. You're like, the human spirit, impressive. So I think that's kind of one of the drivers for doing these, but also it's this sort of nice feedback loop as other people are doing this. You know, you're suffering, but hey, that guy's suffering a lot more. I can do my part of it, okay? So first night, got to it, and this was a picture I got off one of the photographers. That's not actually me in it, but it's one of those moments. I was had my headlamp on, shut off the headlamp, looked up, and you're just like, oh man, you know, the ultimate constellation picture. And just again, that moment, you're like, yeah, my feet are hurting, the whole body's hurting, but I'm going to take that moment, pause, totally by yourself, pitch black, and you got that sky over you. Pretty nice moment. So again, you're looking at those little check-ins during the race just to try and motivate yourself and have that sense of, hey, this is why I'm doing it. And that's one of the parts of this that a great quote a buddy of mine gave me was, make friends with pain and you'll never be alone. I think that's kind of the ethos when you're doing these things. You know, it's always there and you've got to get comfortable with it because it just, you know, you have, as I said, peaks and troughs. You go through moments, I feel pretty good. And then you'd be like, good God, all I want to do is sit down and pull the pin on this because I feel so bad. So you've just got to get that kind of sort of mantra of saying, yep, it's going to be there, but I can hang this, okay? A lot of people like to talk about training and nutrition. This is me going downhill. I think people call this technical. You know, it's tricky stepping in a lot of parts of this. So you really had to make sure you didn't take a fall, bust ankles. I mean, a bunch of people get pulled out of the race because they do break ankles, you know, sprain ankles, all kinds of stuff. So you're always kind of trying to be careful as you're doing that sort of stuff. But one of the aspects of the, I suppose, the scale of this in terms of eating is you got to think of yourself as an engine. You got to keep the engine going the whole time. You don't want to overfuel it or overfill it or under, because if you over it, you'll typically get a sort of gastro distress where you just feel like you're throwing up or you feel bloated, just disgusting because guys are shoving too much calories down their throat. But if you go under, there's a risk you bonk. So you sort of lose energy because you haven't eaten enough. So you're really trying the whole time to keep a consistent flow of food going down your throat and not get to the point where you've overcooked it and you sort of put yourself at risk of finishing the race. One of the elements of training that I've been trying to throw in recently is injecting a lot of fasting into doing fasted runs of like 4 hours, so no food, fast from dinner the night before, do an early morning run for about 4 hours, and really get used to and acclimated to that sort of fat adaptation, so that you're, one, a little bit more efficient at burning fat, but two, you're comfortable when you're moving in between these long aid stations and you don't have to carry as much food. And you can kind of get that vibe where you're, your body can handle it. And I think one of the interesting things a guy just did in May during the COVID lockdown was he did a 100-mile run with 0 calories. He had water and no calorie electrolytes, and he did it. So it's kind of one of those, I think, really interesting elements of like what the human body can do when you train for it, when you've thought about it, and when you've sort of done the real preparation for things. So it's, again, just one of those angles that I think in ultra running, people are still trying to figure out what is optimal. But again, obviously there's boundaries still to be beaten in this space. That's nutrition. Training wise, it's a big thing. I call it time on your feet. You just got to get into that space where you're putting your feet into the shoes for a lot of hours. And so, for example, this would be like Friday night, finish work, normal day, have dinner at home, get all the kit on, sort of 7 o'clock, 1900, head out with all your gear and go for a run out in the hills. And we've got such a good train out here in Wellington, and go to run till 02. I mean, not exactly hitting the clubs, obviously, but it's we all have our thing, but it's like you have to do that because you got to get used to being tired, running in the dark, kind of hating it, so that when you get to the actual race, you're like, oh yeah, I've tasted this before. This isn't too bad, or I've kind of gotten used to this. And it is just getting your body used to moving and eating, so that you're kind of trying to train as you fight, really making sure you get that practice and do those hard yards on the ground. Let's see what we got. And this is second night, which, again, going back to that 9 marathons in a row comment, you can't really think about too far in front of you. You're really just trying to bring your world into a very small perspective, like my next aid station, or, hey, I got to make sure I eat something in the next 15 minutes. So that the minute you start thinking about, hey, I'm going to be out here for like 3 more days, it would just, guys would literally cook themselves thinking about it. Oh, it's too far, I can't take it. So you really had to just forget you were in a 240-mile race and just go for small 10, 20K increments. One of the things that with the sleep factor, I had this colonel in the Ranger Regiment who would fire us up before we go on these training missions. He'd be like, all right, man, we're going to use sleep as a weapon. I'm like, all right, hoorah, way to go, sir. And what that usually meant in practice was, instead of usually like 2 hours a night, we'd get 3 hours a night when he was in charge of the mission. So you're like, all right, sweet. But it is amazing that when you get in that perspective or that frame of mind, what your body can actually handle in terms of the sleep deprivation. It's one of those things where in this, having done that kind of training before, I was like, well, I know what I can handle more or less with the sleep-wise and not cross into that monkey brain space where you just turn into a total drone. So again, it's just, you're trying to build on the experiences past and bring those into these types of races and get that kind of mental fortitude and intestinal fortitude side. Let's see. Hallucinations, I got a few of them. This race was pretty minor. You get stuff like you see a tree stump, you see a gnome's face on it, or you see some eyes in a tree, or you see stuff moving in your peripheral vision. Not that bad for me. And some people, we had a couple racers, one woman went off course and they can see you on your chips, so they can see you, and they, talking to the crew after the race finished, and they kind of have a laugh because they see the little red dot going way off course, and they're kind of like, what is that guy or that girl doing? And so they end up usually sending like a quad bike after the person. They find they're just totally disoriented. They're like, no, I'm going the right direction. Like, dude, you're like 20K off the track, insane stuff. I'm like, no, I'm good. So you see some really freaky stuff happening to people. They just get disorientated. Some people crawl in their sleeping bag and they're just like, oh, I had a dream I was stuck in a cave. You just hear all kinds of weird stories. And it's that really interesting thing that fatigue kicks in. So that's why you're trying to continue to optimize that balance between a little bit of sleep and not so little that you lose it. The ice box, this picture always brings back a bit of a shiver in me. This was when we got to Geyser Pass, which was at elevation, when we first hit the snow. And it was about, I think, the 180-mile mark, so well into the race, feeling like garbage. Got up into this, I'll call it a tent with a buddy, and wind just ripping through this thing. Those little propane heaters were getting blown out, so you get no heat. Guys were trying to sit on little cots trying to get warm or sleep. No way. Everything was frozen. The hot food is supposed to be hot was totally frozen. All the heaters weren't working, so they couldn't get hot soup or coffee or anything. So we kind of sat there for 15 minutes watching this just cacophony of misery in this tent. Everybody's sort of like, oh God, it's too cold. I'm not going to finish this. How am I going to make this work? Looking for new gear to put on. They put on all their cold weather gear. They had nothing else, and they're still looking. I'm like, there's nothing in your bag, dude. Just people losing their minds. So me and this guy just made a call. Let's keep going. So we ended up busting into these trails, and it was I call it the Loop of Despair, because you're going through this trail, totally snow-packed, miserable. And I remember me and this guy were talking. We're like, you get in that real low point. We're like, dude, we're going the wrong way. I'm confident we're the wrong way. He's like, yeah, we're going the wrong way. You're right. And we just keep walking a little farther. He's like, are we going the right way? I don't think so. And you just in that real space of really negative thinking. I mean, I guess the good part was we both done enough races to keep going forward. I think we're on the right path. We were, but it's just amazing with the tricks your brain starts to play on you at that point. And it was probably, the worst part of the race for me, just because it was, dark, cold, and you're just not confident you're even going the right direction. So you're like, let's see how we go here, guys. Then the sun rises, and that's when you kind of get those moments where the energy comes back in you. You're like, oh, all right, I can see we're moving the next aid station. I knew I was going to pick up my two buddies. One was going to be a pacer and get me a little bit of sleep. I was like, maybe I'll get 45 minutes here. What a treat. That'll be a little bit of hot food. And so this was the last part of the snow we hit, and was really probably the point of the race where I was like, all right, 200 miles in, I got this. There's no way I'm going to let 40 miles take me out of this thing. So it's kind of that point at which you flip into, maybe I can do this. This has to happen, even if I have to crawl on the damn thing, So it was really probably the conversion point. And one of the aspects that is hard to give a good rundown is the support crew. The whole time they're going from checkpoint to checkpoint, this RV we had. And so I'd get in there, they'd basically take all my gear, fill up my water, get me food, let me sleep, and get me back up, which was the hardest part. Like, make me change my socks, because you're just kind of you do turn into like a little baby, and you're like, please let me sleep there. No, get up. And so they're pushing me the whole time, and which you really need, because all you want to do is like, dude, give me 3 hours. You're trying to negotiate with them, trying to barter. They're like, no, fool, you won't finish this thing in time. Get going. So they really push you, and certainly some strong words at sometimes, like, God damn it, I'm hating you right now. We weren't too bad, but they are kind of giving you that push to where you're just like, I know you're my friend, but let's keep it at bay here, guys. I need to sleep. So it's that constant tension, which is a lot of fun, and which you really got to appreciate, because there's not many people who will do that for you in life, that run around with you for 84 hours, yelling at you and getting you stuff. Like, dude, I need 2 quesadillas from and a burger. They run back. I said 2, not 1. You turn into a real jackass. So it's quite nice that they still put up with you and talk to you after the race. The finish, it was really, one of the fascinating things that we've seen in these races, and we look like hell in this picture on the right. I'm in the middle, look like I don't know what, zombie. And Paul Hewitson on my right shoulder and Paul Thompson on my left. Paul's here today, actually, but it was just right as we finished. And it's, again, those guys were they get you through the thing. And in the last 8K, I was running with Paul Thompson, and it's not that fast, but I felt really good. I was like, the classic finish line pull. You get it, whether you run a 5K, 10K, whatever. And I started doing like 5:30Ks. I was like, I feel great. I'm a rock star. I'm crushing it. Whole body's in agony, feet feeling like I've got nails in them. But it's like you find these weird bastion reserves of strength that you can pull on your body. It's like, oh yeah, okay, I'll give you a little bit. You got 8K to go. Off we go. And I think it's that real central governor. I'll call it thesis or theory around the brain, is that's the thing that holds you back so often. It's like your body can do crazy stuff, and it's just this thing in between your ears. That's why you got to train it. You got to show it that you can handle that red zone for a long period of time. And I think that's one of the big takeaways of learning from this thing, is that your brain will have that voice going all the time and saying, nah, you can't do this, or no, you need to slow it down, when your body can actually do it. But it was that moment I was like, there's no way I should be running 5:30Ks right now. This is ridiculous. I'm smoked, totally done, and did it. So came in on that, finished about 2000, 8 p.m. at night, and you cross the line, big hugs, this emotion, and all the rest of it with the race director and these two guys, and got some, remember, it was a hot veggie curry. I was like, God, it's the best hot veggie curry I've ever had in my life. And a blanket, and I sat in the chair, and you're just like, it was the moment where everything slips off, and you're just like, oh, thank God, I don't have to move anymore. I'm so happy. So it's really cool to finish it at that point. And then your body, typically after these things just starts, I got big full body convulsions. It's kind of a weird cold / I think auto temperature regulation thing. So I started convulsing is a strong word, shaking aggressively. I was like, okay, it's time to go. And the big thing that had been running through my brain during this race was, I'm going to get a bath at the end of this. So I get back to this hotel room we've rented, and the bathtub is made for like a 5'2" female. I was like, Jesus, that's gotta be the smallest bath I've ever seen in my life. Irrelevant, hot, climbed in that thing. That was the best 30-minute bath of my life. And I think it's just one of those things about the discomfort you find in these things. Really, it's that whole duality of life, right? If you want to go deep, you gotta have that kind of suffering. And then that bath or just sitting down, you're like, wow, that is great. I love this stuff. And it's, you know, if you don't have that in life, it's hard to, and I think that's the risk we have in our modern lifestyles. There's so much comfort. We're bubble wrapped in like, you'll never be cold. You'll never be too hot. You'll never have to sit too long. You know, everything's about comfort. And it's like, it's so easy to absorb that and chase that. And I think that's where these things are kind of, they rip that off you. And you're just like, all right, you're going to suffer for a long period of time, but hey, you're really going to appreciate that hot cup of coffee the next day. So I think that's just kind of the perspective these things can help you give, I think, are the things you try and take away from it. Let's see. Physical aftermath. Sorry, my feet are disgusting on the best of days. This picture doesn't quite do justice, but my feet got really swollen. During the race, I had 2 pairs of shoes, one a bigger size to handle my feet getting swollen. That worked pretty well. So I didn't have any real blisters, but it's just that impact, like just touching my feet hurt at the end of it. So pretty good result. Didn't lose any toenails, which was great. Very happy with that. It was unusual in some sense, although I probably should lose some of these disgusting things. Lost about 3 kgs more or less, I think. So not a huge amount of weight just because it was so long. You're still eating quite a bit and drinking quite a bit. But yeah, your body is just, you're not able to keep a replacement calories to the point where you don't come out with any deficit. So that ultimately led to what I call caveman hunger, which was just deep, deep hunger at both the next day. I think I fell asleep that night with like, I'd eaten half a pizza and then I fell asleep with a slice in my hand with my buddies in the hotel room, just out, and woke up the next morning starving. We went to this diner. I just put the hammer down. It was, you know, if you looked at me eating, it was disgusting. It was just like, yep, I'm still hungry, dude, keep bringing it. So I had that for about 2 or 3 days. It's this really intense hunger, just trying to refeed, and just your body saying, dude, you just destroyed me. You're gonna do some serious eating and sitting for a little while. All right, that's sweet, I'll do that. Body-wise, soreness, didn't rip anything, tear anything, just really sore for like 3 days. Everything hurts. It's like everything from ears down was just sore. You're just like, oh, you just feel like a 90-year-old man walking around. That was all right though, because I didn't have to, I think we went to Vegas with my buddy. We basically sat by the pool. So it's a pretty good recovery period, I have to say. Let's see. So a little distillation, folks. Again, I don't want to get into lessons, but it's sort of the things that resonate with me, and maybe they'll resonate with you. But it is that whole, I guess, to practice discomfort. And again, I'll go back to my Army days. I had this colonel who was he was a really cool guy, but you get up in front, we're going out for a couple days of training that we're just going to be brutal. He's like, all right, Rangers, we're going to practice sucking. I'm like, you bastard. I know how to suffer, dude. And it's funny because I look back at that now, I'm like, he was dead right. That was exactly what we needed. If I went back and tried to do some of that training in the Ranger right now, being an older dude who has kids, pretty soft, I would get crushed. But it's like when you're in the zone and you do practice it, you can absolutely do amazing things. I think that's where these races, it doesn't matter if you're doing ultras, a 5K, walking your dog, it's constantly putting yourself into a little bit of discomfort and practicing it. Because that's the thing, that's all it is. There's no magic in any of this. Nobody cares if you go out and run at 0 2 in the morning, irrelevant. It's just, you got to do these things though, if you want to actually achieve it. It's just small little steps. That's all it is. I'll call this a negative voice. Some people call it the monkey brain, but it's like, I have it, everybody has it. You talk to any good athlete, any person, it's the thing when you're at work, like, I don't know if I can handle this project. I don't know if I can finish this race. Maybe my feet will blow up. Maybe my hips will blow out. Maybe I'll just be weak and won't be able to finish, or maybe I can't deliver on this big year-long project. It's that voice, everybody gets it. And I think what these races have shown me is that you got to sort of embrace the voice, note it, but box that bad boy up, and because everybody has it. And if you can't put it to the side, and ideally you're able to say, well, I've done something slightly like this before, or this is a little harder than the last thing, but the last thing I did, I achieved that. It's really just providing that counter to it and constantly saying, don't let that negative voice define you. Because I don't care, you read all these books by world-class athletes, podcasts, they have the same thing. It's like, they're in the same amount of pain. Talk to guys like Lance Armstrong, who I know, whatever, has a colored checkered past, but it's like the pain that they're able to handle is no greater or worse than the same guy doing the same effort, but it's the fact that they can sit in that zone. And that's just, again, it's that practice of saying, I'm not going to let that negative voice tell me I can't do it. That's all it is. Nothing's clever about it. Last point I'll make is look through the keyhole. I call this kind of it's really just trying to get that microcosm I talked about, where if you think about 9 marathons in a row, you won't even get out and start the race. Like, that's ridiculous. That's way too much. So it's about just putting almost a box around your view and saying, I've got to get to the next, I've got to do the next deliverable for this project. Oh yeah, I know it's a 2-year project, but if I do this part, we'll get there. And just don't think about that long game, because it just sometimes will be too overwhelming. I think humans, we're really good at sometimes getting that good strategic perspective, which is useful. But then once you're in it, you just got to break it down and get small. Because I think that's the only way you can handle these types of challenges. Work or in events like this is to just get real small. And that is probably the last bit of I've got, guys, with one last shot going down. This was in the last 40 miles going down. That's actually not me or Paul Hewison, but good indicative of, again, the vistas that you sort of experienced in this race. So I'll cut it there, folks, and love to hear any questions, answer, or discussion points if you've got them. Up top. I need the mic.
That was a really fantastic talk. Would you do, I've got 2 questions. Would you do it again? And if so, what would you do differently?
Ooh, do it again. No, although I've committed, actually that guy's sitting up there, because we have a bit of a ongoing challenge between each other with Paul Hewison, who was one of my colleagues on this race, where, you know, a little bit of one-upmanship. Like, I've got the 240 longest race. He's done an amazing amount of more and harder races, but I've got him right now. So ideally he'll go back and do that, and I can be his support crew. And the second part of that is where we've thought about it, and where I think, you know, again, every time you do a race for the first time, you're always gonna look back at it and say, oh, I could have done this, that, and this. Probably the big ones was that downtime I talked about. Sleep-wise, I don't think I slept too much, but I jerked around quite a bit. Sitting in my chair, I remember sitting in my chair looking at this fire in front of me. I was like, I'm so warm right now. And I remember little parts of the fire falling off and burning the jacket I had. I was like, I don't care. I'm just going to sit here for a little bit longer, you know? This is cool. And it was at one of these aid stations where I didn't have my any of my guys to be like, come on, Campbell, let's get going. So I was just like lollygagging. And I think that's where I burned a bunch of time. I think easily do, you know, like, I'd like to think 4 or 5 hours less next time. But ideally, I'll bring that learning when my buddy does it next time.
New Zealand territorials for about 3 years while I was at medical school.
Awesome.
Which was actually really amazing training, and in hindsight it's some of the best training I ever did. And I guess I wonder how much of, you know, your sort of army experience really helped, and whether you think that army training could be more widely kind of not compulsory, but do you think
The draft, yeah.
you think it has merits? You know,
yeah, really interesting question. I mean, ethos-wise, I think, you know, for me, it had always sort of called to me, and I think having gone through that training, it's kind of that thing, no matter what you've done in life and you try to do something hard, you're always gonna look back at what you've done before. And I think having that stuff in my backstory helped me, like, oh yeah, that was miserable, I've done that before. Is this gonna be worse? Possibly, but I know I've done that. So I think it's really just gives you that perspective from military training. Having said that, you know, again, my buddy Paul and other people who do these ultra runs have no military background, and they are amazing. So it's like, it's certainly, it can be useful, but I think there's also, you know, whether you're, you know, and I always give my buddy grief, but he's runs a roofing business, and he's had just years of training on the roof. And it's like that hard physical labor, I think, gives him a massive sort of competitive advantage in these type of events where you're just used to using your body all the time. Whereas like the rest of us sitting in offices, I mean, how much are we sitting on our butts? Oh, maybe you have a standing desk, you're standing a little bit, but it's like, it's such a different paradigm for your body to go through where you're constantly moving, testing it. And I think that kind of stuff gives you, you know, easily as much of an advantage or benefit as like military training. Headspace wise, military training can be great, but I think, you know, it doesn't, it's so many, it turns a lot of people off as well. So I think I've got friends who are just like, dude, there's no way I'm doing the military thing. I'm like, yeah, fair enough. So I think it can be great, but there's so many other ways to find that kind of mental fortitude in life, I think. So yeah, I think there's a wide variety of options.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. A couple of comments, really. One, that it was voluntary that you did it, you know, say,
yes.
in the army.
Yes.
You chose to do it, and you had control over it, and I think that what you've described in a very moving way. So I think that's really interesting to get jobs where you feel you have a measure of control, and then you can push yourself. The other thing that I was reflecting on, particularly as you brought up the gender thing, is the issue about childbirth, because a fair proportion of the group here would have gone through childbirth, and you've probably supported your partner through childbirth. And that's what you describe is very similar for those of us who had very long labours. You have to have exactly that same kind of feeling, you know, the next breath, the next push. And so that it's got quite a lot in common with that. So it doesn't entirely surprise me that women do very well at that.
Oh yeah, I think, pain threshold, yes, you know, as a man, obviously it's hard to put yourself into that experience, but having seen my wife do it, you're just like, yeah, that's got to be way harder than doing this foolishness, which is, again, voluntary. So yeah, it's that, indeed, it's that whole, autonomy, mastery, control. I think, if you have those things in something you're doing, whether it's your job or an event, it's always going to be, easier to do it, I think, in a sense. So it's get those, and then obviously if you can leverage that kind of sense of, female pain threshold. I think that's why, Courtney Dauwalter, who won the race and broke the record time, she's just, this ridiculous dynamo. I think she's only about maybe like 5'7", 5'8", but just unstoppable. She just crushed. She beat the closest guy was like 10 hours behind her. Just dominating it. So pretty cool to see that kind of performance.
Hi. So I've got two things to note from your talk that I thought were curious. You mentioned discomfort. I just wondered if you meant discomfort was it more a mental discomfort than a physical? Because it seemed that way, like you're overcoming your own mind all the time. If that's the case, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, I'll hit that one. I mean, it's twofold, really. It is the interplay between brain body is so strong. It's like, I think that's what's often interesting to unpick in these is that oftentimes you'll find that the body signals, you're like, oh my God, my legs are burning, my feet are hurting, my whole body's aching. I should stop. But it's really just this thing up here. It's like, yeah, and we all have it in us, this ridiculous amount of pain the human body is built to take. And so it is, you're trying to fight, and you can't partition the two, but I think a lot of it is just discovering that mostly it is your brain telling you to stop. Guys who run world-class Olympic times on the mile, you watch their progressions, and during their career, they'll hit like 4 seconds off for like a year. And then suddenly they'll break through. It's like, what's going on with that? Why can they suddenly break through? The training's the same, but a lot of it's just they've experienced it and they're like, oh, okay, I'm now this comfortable in that pain zone. I can actually push through. And I think it is just trying to figure out where that governor sits and why it breaks you sometimes. And then saying, okay, I can maybe push past that.
Thank you. And the other question was around, you kind of mentioned it in a roundabout way about vulnerability, the way the race is, it forces you to be vulnerable with those around you. And I wonder if this sort of extensive pressure that you put on yourself has helped you develop your vulnerability. And if so, has that spread over to your life, or does it just remain with your sport achievements?
Yeah, great question. Wow, that's a deep one. Yeah, I think I want to put males in a box, but often expressing emotion, being vulnerable is often discouraged. I went to these ridiculous environments like boarding school, the military, where those things often aren't rewarded or incentivized. And I think, what I've learned from these events is how, particularly with my buddies who support me through this, is like how much you're relying on somebody else and like showing the weakness of like when you're literally at your worst, you're like, dude, I've got nothing. And they find a way to get you back up. So I think it's really sort of using those types of events to figure out, hey, it's okay to ask for help. And actually it's, makes people feel useful when you're actually able to say, I don't have this, man, I need some help. And so, have I applied those as well in the rest of my life? Probably not, but it's certainly something that you do park away and be like, hey, when you're at your worst or when you really need help, do ask for it, because people actually enjoy it. They're like, hell yeah, I'll get in there and help you, man. So I think that's the thing you try and take from this. But yeah, I think guys, generally, we're not great at it.
Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, really good talk, and I enjoyed that. Let's go back to pain a little bit. So you're talking about the central governor theory, where, it's this sort of almost a fail-safe system, right, to stop you from pushing yourself too far. So if you're doing these distances, there is a real physical danger of pushing too far. So how do you know when to listen to the central governor, and how do you know when to push on through?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, there's actually a great book. I think I've put in the back of my slides. Endure that by Alex Hutchinson, who did a bunch of really interesting, I don't think he did the research, but he's kind of compilation of the research on this notion of a governor. And I think my experience with where that point gets crossed, where guys, talked about that guy at the beginning, where you're getting into like kidney damage type territory of like, clearly there's not like, I'm going to hard my way through this. For me, I had an atrocious race in Australia. It was my first venture in 100 miles. And I got to the 100K mark and my hips just like seized up. It was just like, it was like being the Tin Man without any oil in the Wizard of Oz, where, you get rained on. Just had nothing. I remember getting to the aid station and I had two buddies there and I was like, I'm done, dude. I got nothing. And it wasn't like they were like, oh, all right, dude, we'll just let you focus and get back into it. I mean, my training was all messed up. I didn't know what I was doing. It was classic rookie stuff. But it was, I knew there was no benefit in like me crawling or gimping. I was like, my hips are done, dude. It was like my hip flexors are just locked up. So I think, you find that kind of barrier where physically you've gone past the point at which your body will accommodate it. I think it's a really interesting question because guys do that all the time. They push past, they get into, extreme, probably, heat exhaustion is the biggest one where people do get into kidney issues. But I remember a guy in the military, he finished this pack march we were doing, collapsed at the end of it. And it's like he literally crossed the line, collapsed, and the medics had to put like 4 IVs in him. And he ended up having some kidney damage. Now you're like, what? And he said he like in the last 5 or 6K, he had lost, he wasn't there. He'd gone bye-bye. And so he literally pushed to the point. His brain had allowed him to go past the point and he went down on autopilot. So it's a weird one when you look at what the human body can do. Obviously it's detriment, but it's almost like there is in a way no limit, but you don't want to really, ideally you want to stop right before that point. But it's a hard one because everybody's gonna be different. So it's really hard to come up with any kind of sense of, oh, this hurts really bad. Like one person's hurt really bad can be another person's, I'm gonna die. So it's a hard one, I think. I've found it a few times. I think that's part of the lure of these things is that you're trying to sort of see where that line sits for you as an individual, right?
Hey, thank you so much for that talk. I've never run more than 5Ks in my life, but I could see parallels with my PhD experience, which I finished last year.
The true long run, right?
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask you, I could see lots of parallels. And one thing with doing my PhD, and actually my master's was worse, I was so looking forward to finishing and I expected to have a sense of achievement and relief. And actually it was quite a feeling of flatness afterwards. And I wondered whether you had an awesome feeling of achievement, or did you also experience a kind of?
Yeah, it's again, a good question. I think one of the big things, if you're doing this kind of stuff, you got to love the process, right? And I think the training, the running with other people, the build up, the thought of how you're going to do it and how you're going to achieve the race is you have to get into that part of it. And I think when you're talking about something like a PhD or master's, long, hard, difficult slogs. Ideally you're enjoying the material. And so it's like kind of absorption of knowledge and ideally creating new knowledge to drive you. And I think for me, it's like very much similar though. You finish it, that moment of like complete catharsis. Oh God, I've done it. And it's, you try not to get the ego into it, but it's like, okay, great. So what I've tried to do, and following lead of other runners, is like you try to put another event sort of in it before you finish that one. You're like, okay, I'm going to do this one. And then I'm going to have my next event planned out at least. So you're in that perpetual sort of state because I think, challenge is what we all love and need. And the minute that challenge goes, we're terrible. Humans are bad at it. You're like, okay, challenge over. It's bubble wrap time for the rest of the time of your life. It's like, no, that's where you're like, ugh. I think that's where you get the real down because you're like, I got nothing. So I think it's putting that next intermediate, even if it's a small goal there, so that because you do get that kind of, I remember the next day I was kind of like, all right, done the Moab, but I've got this race, but you still feel a little bit like, oh, it was good, but done. So yeah, I think it's the same thing. You just got to have those next steps.
Yeah, you've got time for one last question.
Sorry, I've got one more. Sticky one. I guess in terms of the experience, physical, psychological, was there a spiritual element for you? Was there any sense of like a God or a spiritual element?
Yeah, I think part of the interesting things about these things is like, am I chasing God? I don't know. I don't, you sort of go after these things of what you found. And I don't think I've ever sort of gotten to a point of like, okay, I found my God. Interestingly, I was running with a guy at this race and he found his brother had died the year before. He did the race and he only made it like 100K. And he sort of talked through this internal conversation he was having with his brother's spirit. And it sounds all very, sort of new agey, but he tapped out of that race, but he came back the next year than the one I was doing. He's like, I've made peace with my brother. Part of that was doing this race again and completing it. And so there's something in there, I think that's, spiritual. It's just, hey, even when you look up at that night sky, you're like, there's something bigger than all of us, right? We live in a big, crazy, beautiful universe. But I've never had that moment of like pure religiosity. I think it's just that sense of, more wonder rather than like that concrete, oh yes, there is a higher power. So it's, maybe I'm still chasing it, but some people do find it. I mean, absolutely. That's why they're compelled to do it. They're like, that's, I've touched, pushed myself so far that I've sort of touched the God's eye during this thing. So yeah, it's intriguing sort of sport, I think, for people to try and find that sometimes.
So thank you very much. We've sort of run out of time. We've got one comment from the Zoom audience, which was, hey Seth, great talk. Have you thought about long distance cycling? Easier on the body, especially the joints, and easy on the feet.
Yeah, it's a great question. I gotta say my Ironman experience, I'm not a big fan of the bike. I mean, I'll do it, I get it, but it's like the thought of, the Race Across America, if ever, there's some great books on that, but no, I think would be the short answer. That just sounds like agony. God, that bike seat, nightmare. No go.
Thank you very much. And
all right, thanks guys.
Thank you everyone for coming. Next week we have Michael Baker and Nick Wilson talking about COVID. So